Wow. He at least would live his own life according to what he recognized as the voice of a new humanity, active, unafraid, and unashamed. That was the young James Joyce's resolution at the tender age of 20, about 2 years before the partly fictional events related in Ulysses take place. You think those words might have any bearing on the events and ultimate meaning of Joyce's monumentally misunderstood classic? I do. Welcome to the Fellows Cafe's chapter-by-chapter synopsis of James Joyce's Ulysses. If you're new here, this is the third video in my synoptic series. Looking back, the first two videos brought us through episode 5, where we left Bloom on a street corner contemplating taking a bath and his limp penis floating in it, languid and flower-like. Well, he did have the bath, and it seems he didn't, as he put it, combine business with pleasure and masturbate there. However, now it's nearing 11 o'clock, the time appointed for Paddy Dignam's funeral. So episode 6 begins with Martin Cunningham stepping into the funeral carriage, followed by a guy named Mr. Power. "Come on, Simon," says Cunningham, and Bloom politely says, "After you," to Stephen Dedalus' father, Simon Dedalus. Mr. Dedalus gets in saying, "Yes, yes." And then Cunningham says, "Are we all here now? Come along, Bloom." What a wonderfully brusque start to one of my favorite chapters in the book. It's a straightforward read, and yet we learn so much about Bloom and the world he inhabits. But before that, let's quickly recap episodes 1 through 5. Now, fortunately, if you've watched those first two videos, most of the heavy lifting has already been done. The situation set up, if you will. Two men, one young and artistic and the other older, more practical and more established, if you will, are wandering the streets of Dublin, mostly alone, deeply isolated, and at odds with the customs and values of the world they find themselves citizens of. Episodes 1 to 3, part 1 of the book, reintroduce us to the James Joyce alter ego Stephen Dedalus, and as I said, it's crucial to understand that Stephen is Joyce, but not the fully mature artist/shaman who will write such works as A Portrait, Ulysses, and Finnegan's Wake. He is the struggling young Joyce 10 years before beginning the writing of Ulysses. Now, as luck would have it, following the posting of those first two videos, I happened upon a copy of Joyce's discarded manuscript of Stephen Hero, which would eventually be reworked into the far more publishable A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Now, I'm not one to recommend books to read. However, anybody interested in Joyce and his works really should pick up a copy of Stephen Hero. Why? Mainly because it's a much easier book to read than either A Portrait or Ulysses. There's less artistry to it. The narrative is more straightforward and throws a ton more light upon the young Stephen/Joyce's struggles towards artistry through the crucial years of, say, 18 to 20, not to mention his relation to his family, his friends, school, society, and religion, as well as the young women of his day. There's that, but what's more, it truly reinforces the notion that Ulysses is so much more than the mere modern-day retelling of Homer's Odyssey that is endlessly trotted out by people who, in my opinion, should know better, or at the very least widen their reading interests. Anyway, in my video James Joyce's Ulysses, Awakening to the Wonder, I said that Ulysses was, simply put, the story of James Joyce's own awakening to the wonder and mystery that is all life around him and around us today, in this world and this universe we, you, me, and Joyce inhabit. Following those videos, I stumbled again upon a quote by Joseph Campbell. It went, "Next in Ulysses and the Magic Mountain, two accounts of quests through the mixed conditions of a modern civilization for an informing principle substantial to existence." Far better put, of course, but pretty much exactly what I had said in my earlier video. However, I have one more passage I want to read to you from Stephen Hero. This is Stephen Dedalus/James Joyce, 2 years or so before the events fictionally related in Ulysses take place, and truly illustrates where he's coming from, and more importantly for our understanding of Ulysses towards the end, where he is trying to go. Now, as an aside, he's going to be extremely harsh on Catholicism here, no doubt making the early manuscript completely unpublishable, but remember, this is Ireland a century ago, and we often can grow to hate what threatens to suffocate or drown us. This is from Stephen Hero, page 198. The deadly chill of the atmosphere of the college paralyzed Stephen's heart. In a stupor of powerlessness, he reviewed the plague of Catholicism. He seemed to see the vermin begotten in the catacombs in an age of sickness and cruelty. He's talking about the late Roman Empire there, folks. Issuing forth upon the plains and mountains of Europe. Sorry to interrupt here, folks, but that there is one of the biggest ideas you've never heard of before, namely a Northern European pseudomorphosis, which perhaps Oswald Spengler may or may not have grasped. Joseph Campbell certainly did, as he elaborates in his creative mythology, and frankly, although there may be others, but besides Joyce and myself, I don't know a single soul on the planet, past or present, who truly grasps its paramount importance in understanding who and where we are today. Wow, no wonder looking around the cafe's always empty. Anyway, that's definitely a topic for another video. Actually though, I've already attempted it with my rather awkwardly put Omphalos Cafe episode 3, where we all went wrong. But okay, enough plugging unwatchable videos. The book goes on, and remember, this is Stephen Dedalus imagining. Like the plague of locusts described in Callista, they seem to choke the rivers and fill up the valleys. They obscured the sun. Contempt of the body, of human nature, weakness, nervous tremblings, fear of day and joy, distrust of man and life, hemiplegia, he's talking about paralysis, of the will, beset the body, burdened and disaffected in its members by its black, tyrannous lice. Exaltation of the mind before joyful beauty, exaltation of the body in free confederate labors, every natural impulse towards health and wisdom and happiness had been corroded by the pest of these vermin. The spectacle of the world in thrall filled him with the fire of courage. Then he, at least, though living at the farthest remove from the center of European culture, marooned on an island in the ocean, though inheriting a will broken by doubt, and a soul the steadfastness of whose hate became as weak as water in siren arms, he would live his own life according to what he recognized as the voice of a new humanity, active, unafraid, and unashamed. Once again, he, Stephen Dedalus / James Joyce, at least, would live his own life according to what he recognized as the voice of a new humanity, active, unafraid, and unashamed. And that, folks, is what Ulysses is actually about. And that, folks, is also what Bloom fictionally represents, a new humanity, active, unafraid, and unashamed. Anyway, in Stephen Hero, it's shortly after those reflections that Stephen skips out of yet another deadening class and chases down a young, full-bodied woman named Emma, whose name is briefly mentioned in Ulysses, by the way, to proposition her in a frank, honest, and natural manner. But of course, she being bound by her Irish Catholic upbringing, the young and yearning Stephen / Joyce is rebuffed. To me, that scene throws a world of light on the importance of the young Joyce meeting his wife-to-be, Nora Barnacle, who no doubt serves in Ulysses as model for both the mature Molly, as well as, in all likelihood, the young and very game Sissy Caffrey. And significantly, the day the young Joyce would walk out with Nora, who would consent to spend the rest of her life with him, was June 16th, 1904, the day of the events of Ulysses. There's deep and rich meaning in all that, folks, if we can get past all the Homeric parallel noise, that is. And as a final word from Stephen Hero, in his appeal to the young Emma, he utters what to me is another highly significant line for our understanding of Ulysses. In an effort to explain himself to her, he says, "I live such a strange life, without help or sympathy from anyone." Ah, without help or sympathy from anyone. Perhaps with those words in mind, we're ready for part 2 of Ulysses, episodes 4 and 5, where we are introduced to Leopold Bloom. Now, outwardly at any rate, there is little remarkable about him. He sort of comes across as a fumbling, ineffectual dreamer at first glance, but as I've hopefully started to show, there's far more to this Bloom character than initially meets the eye. However, as I've also hopefully started to show, as the embodiment of Joyce's new humanity, active, unafraid, and unashamed, he is, as a consequence, deeply isolated, not only from his fellow Dubliners, but also, unfortunately, from his wife, Molly. That estrangement was brought home in episode 4 when we first encountered Bloom at home. Out on the streets in 5 it was reinforced, and now in episode 6 it will be even further emphasized, as is evidenced by that very first little scene climbing into the carriage. In fact, it would be fun to go through chapter 6 and count the number of slights, rudenesses and discourtesies Bloom endures during the long carriage ride and then later at the cemetery. There's Simon Dedalus' failure to acknowledge Bloom's polite deferral to him climbing in to start. Then Bloom is interrupted several times in the carriage trying to relate a story. They all look askance at him when he comments a quick heart attack is the best way to go. He's inadvertently bumped by a grave digger. John Henry Menton both barely acknowledges Bloom's politely pointing out his dented hat, and then later he wonders aloud why the beautiful Marion Tweedy would go and, as he puts it, marry a coon like that. Also, comically, towards the end, a guy named Hines goes around gathering the names of those in attendance to be published later in the paper. He stops to ask Bloom his Christian name, scribbles the name of a man wearing a Macintosh down as Macintosh, and will eventually, to Bloom's chagrin, include his name in the paper as L. Boom. Is there any wonder Bloom's thoughts have turned inward? Like James Joyce, you might say, back then and even today, no one wants to hear his opinions. No one is ready for what he has to say. Anyway, the episode, as I said, is fairly straightforward. We ride with Bloom and 3 others in a carriage through the bustling streets of Dublin to the funeral of Paddy Dignam. Outside the window, the city, with its sights and sounds and people pass, many of whom lift their hats in a custom Simon Dedalus is glad to see hasn't died out, which pretty much typifies the elder Dedalus' outlook on life, bound in the past as he is. Inside the carriage, the men discuss various things and were privy to Bloom's take on a wide variety of topics, from the other men to Blazes Boylan and manhood, death and life in general, as well as learning more about his relationship to Molly and his daughter Millie, his father who committed suicide by swallowing a bottle of pills, and his dead infant son Rudy, whom he could have, as he puts it, brought up to be independent. Now, Rudy's death and not having a son to pass on his views and values and unique sense of self-sufficiency is doubtless a huge contributor to his current paralysis and, as I said, loss of mojo. Indeed, as we learn later, he and Molly haven't had sexual intercourse since Rudy's passing, a full 10 years ago now. Also, at one point an old wives' tale flits to mind. Whether true or not doesn't really matter, because just his thinking about it must weigh on his spirit. He thinks, if the child is healthy, it's from the mother. If not, from the father. Rudy died at age 11 days, and if Bloom subscribes to that little ditty, it has to be a blow at the deepest level of his masculine being. Anyway, in the midst of death, he reflects his life, and that, in the end, is the life we live, folks. The stream of life, as he imagined in the last episode, every death is balanced by a birth, the ever-ongoing flow of life. If here in episode 6 we're accompanying Bloom to a funeral, later on in episode 14 we will accompany him to the lying-in hospital for a birth. And to me, that is the richness and the beauty of the book. I mean, in the course of the day, where doesn't Bloom take us? Through all the mixed conditions of a modern civilization, as Joseph Campbell states. Oh, and by the way, who in the carriage is the first to draw attention to our other young and solitary hero in Dublin? Stephen Dedalus? Bloom, of course. And that's it. Bloom being a representative of the new humanity. Don't expect any old-fashioned sentimentalities regarding death and an afterlife. Death feeds life. We, buried, are the food of other living beings, worms, maggots, and rats. Our blood nourishes the earth and the plants whose roots drink of its richness. The cycle is ever ongoing, and the flow is continual. There's death, Bloom seems to say, but let us tend to the living. Paddy's gone, but who will look after what's left behind, his wife and 5 children? And he contributes generously to a little fund to tide the family over until the details of the insurance is straightened out. As in Chapter 5, we witness the ritual of the church, in this case the Requiem Mass for the repose of the dead, from Bloom's outsider's perspective, as a sort of non-participant. We see it as it is, and yet appreciate what it could all symbolize for the believing multitude. In the episode's last page, after the body of Dignam is lowered into the grave and the grave diggers have done their work, The crowd disperses and Bloom makes his way towards the gate. Back to the world again, he thinks. Enough of this place. And the chapter ends with one more slight, but not before he thinks to himself, plenty to see and feel yet. Feel live, warm beings near you. Let them sleep in their maggoty beds. They are not going to get me this innings. And then he thinks, warm beds, full-blooded life. Indeed, warm, full-blooded life. That's Bloom leaving the cemetery, returning to the life of the city. And that's it for episode 6. As always, thanks for watching the Omphalos Cafe. See you next time when we move into episode 7, an outwardly strange chapter which contains Joyce's biggest universally unrecognized joke on the staid world of proper morals and manners and polite but unimaginative scholarship. Now, how's that for a cliffhanger? Bye for now.